It is a basic fact of journalistic life. When a reporter wants to ask someone a question, it is entirely possible that person might not want to answer. This week, two Boston Globe journalists tried to give readers an inside look at how that dynamic can play out. But if they were expecting sympathy, they may have been disappointed. On Monday, the Boston Globe's Shirley Long and Laura Krantz tried to catch Governor Charlie Baker after a speech by UMass President Marty Meehan, even though an aide said Baker might not have time to talk.
So we made a beeline to the front of the room where the governor was sitting after Meehan gave his speech, and we decided to, she would stand on one side of him and I would stand on the other, and we were very close to them, within a foot of him.
Baker was shaking hands and didn't look to be in a hurry, Long says. Even so, he didn't talk to them.
His press aide, was standing in between us saying, no, no, no. And I was trying to catch the governor's eye, but he was very good at avoiding eye contact that evening.
The next day, Long and Krantz pushed back in a reporter's notebook piece that detailed their attempt. Long says they had two goals: call out Baker's evasiveness and show the public how the journalistic sausage gets made.
If you read our story, it's somewhat of a lighthearted tone. It wasn't meant to be a gotcha piece. It was meant to provide readers a window into this world.
The reaction from readers was mixed, with some panning Baker and others calling his non-response a non-story. The Herald's Bob McGovern agreed, tweeting, "If I wrote a column every time I was blown off by a public official, I'd have enough content for a book called Journalism." Commonwealth magazine wondered why, with Baker standing right there, Long and Krantz didn't just ask their question anyway.
We could have done that. We could have gotten the governor's face and shouted at him a question. But we were trying to be respectful.
For the record, Boston 25's Mike Beaudet says the governor told him he hadn't even known Long and Krantz were there. But Long doesn't buy it.
He is very tall. Maybe he only saw the tops of our head, but we were standing fairly close to him. It might have been difficult to ignore us.
Then again, it might not. So this was not an event on Charlie Baker's public schedule. It was an event where Marty Meehan was talking about the cost of a UMass education, which is what they wanted Governor Baker to weigh in on. I have to say that I had the same reaction as Commonwealth magazine did. If I am this close to you, Jennifer, and I really want to ask a question of you, I'm just going to ask it. I'm not going to ask your press aide who's sitting here, hey, is it okay if we ask Jennifer a question? Shirley suggested, and I appreciate Shirley, who is a WGBH contributor. I appreciate her sitting down to talk with us about this. She said, they could have gotten in the governor's face and shouted at him. I think there's something in between not speaking to him at all and getting in his face and shouting at him.
Well, and even if she had specifically asked the question, he's not under an obligation to answer it right there. I mean, there are other press availabilities, and I think...
Including one earlier that day.
Right, and I think generally Charlie Baker is pretty accessible to journalists and to the public. He takes calls on the radio once in a while, and I don't see this as a story. I really don't.
I'm half sympathetic to what Shirley Leung and Laura Krantz did. I like the public being given something of a look of the process that goes on every day. I'm not sympathetic to the argument of, oh, this goes on all the time, this is how the game is played. The public doesn't know that. The public ought to be let in on that, have some transparency. That said, I don't know that this is the hill that I would want to defend. It wasn't that big a deal. The governor had a press availability earlier that day where they could have perhaps gotten the question to one of the State House reporters and had them ask the same thing. Is this, overall, is this a big deal? No. But I think that this might have been the wrong issue to do this kind of a piece on.
I was just puzzled. I read it and then I thought, why is everybody talking about it? I was just completely puzzled because I didn't understand why you couldn't ask a question without shouting. You're close. You can ask. To your point, he does not have to answer, but you can ask your question. I'm left puzzled because both of them are very good reporters. So I'm left puzzled about why you told me about it. I just don't understand. Now, I'm very confused by the whole thing. And I've now heard everybody talk about it. I'm still puzzled. Yeah. I just don't get it.
on one hand, if there's any issue that journalists have been traditionally allowed to be activists on, essentially it's that they're the right to public information, right? We do stories saying we sent FOIA requests to Freedom of Information Act requests to lots of places and they didn't reply. That's an area where we defend freedom of speech, we defend accountability on the part of government officials. So I want to be sympathetic. But I tend to come around where everyone else does, that this seems like a pretty small bore affair. If this was happening on day 30 of a press blackout, then sure, then you absolutely write that story. If Charlie Baker had a long-term reputation for ignoring the press, then okay, fine. But it does seem like a lot of fuss over a relatively minor event, particularly when, as you know, we've all been in positions near government officials. You know, it's just saying, hey, Governor, that's not a terrible thing to say, and it seemed like an option that would have been available.
I will say that if you are close to him and you say, hey, Governor, it is no guarantee he's going to answer. I had a memorable exchange with Governor Baker during the presidential campaign season when I wanted him to weigh in on Governor Romney's really remarkable speech denouncing Donald Trump. I thought it was appropriate to ask him about that. His predecessor as governor, former GOP nominee, in a speech like we've never heard before. And he really did not want to answer my questions about that topic. I'll tweet out a link to the video. So just because you ask doesn't mean you're going to get an answer, but you never know unless you try.
And he wasn't looking down on the top of your head.
He was not. That's very true.
I must say, I didn't get the lighthearted part. I read it. I didn't get. Did somebody else get the lighthearted?
No,
I missed
didn't.
the
Well,
lighthearted.
they joked about his height.
Yeah.
But,
I
think they were ambivalent about whether they wanted
Okay.
to make a serious
Okay,
point
maybe.
I
about
think it was
elected
lighthearted in the sense that it was more of a story about them than about the governor. And I think in some ways a lot of media is moving in that direction where they're making their journalists part of the story.
Yeah.